Our first panel discussion we're going to be having this morning is called Valuing Nature. So what I'm going to do is introduce everybody right now, and then kind of we'll ask people to come up one by one, and they're going to talk. And then at the end of that time period, again, you've got the Q&A sheets on your table. Please write down any questions or thoughts or comments that come to mind while the folks are talking. And we'll have a 10-minute Q&A at the end of this with all three of the participants. So the first speaker with our Valuing Nature panel is Christine Johnson. She will speak about land conservation and our economy. Christine is the president of the Conservation Foundation of the Gulf Coast. A fifth-generation Floridian, she shares the foundation's vision of creating an emerald necklace of pocket parks and protected lands along the Gulf Coast. To date, the Conservation Foundation has preserved almost 8,600 acres across 33 properties along the Gulf Coast of Florida. Following her, Dr. Jay Leveroni will discuss habitat restoration within the Sarasota Bay watershed, past accomplishments and challenges. Dr. Leveroni is the staff scientist for the Sarasota Bay Estuary Program. He received his doctorate from the University of South Florida College of Marine Sciences in 2007, focusing his studies on the effects of red tide on early life stages of local shellfish. His current focus has been the development of numeric nutrient criteria and a monitoring strategy for tidal creeks. And finally, Dr. David Randall will be talking about sustainable tourism. He currently directs the Sustainable Tourism Concentration for the USF Patel College of Global Sustainability, and he serves as the managing director of the International Ocean Institute Waves of Change Initiative. He also serves on the International Ecotourism Society Research and Education Council and the board of directors for the Florida Society of Ethical Ecotourism. So I look forward to hearing from all of these folks, but first, please join me in welcoming Christine Johnson.
Good morning.
Hello.
Thank you, Cooper. Can everyone hear me all right?
Yep.
You know, when I was asked to do this, I was very honored, but I'll have to tell you, it's a little bit different doing this to your own peers than doing it to like the Rotary Club. So be kind, please. You heard my introduction. I am president of the Conservation Foundation, and I am a fifth-generation Floridian. So this mission of saving land, my homeland, I grew up in Manatee County on the Manatee River, barefoot most of the time, and in stitches usually as well. My mom always said, those that don't listen must feel. So I ended up with lots of stitches in my feet just because I would not wear shoes. It's very important. And this mission of saving land in Florida's Gulf Coast just absolutely makes my heart sing. So I thought today, what could I talk about that you all maybe didn't know? Because again, you're the choir. So first and foremost, I think it's about why it matters, which I know you guys know why it matters, but I'd like to start with just asking you guys to think about why you live here. I live here because my family's here. I live here as well because it's beautiful. But when I ask this question to a lot of people, they say, oh, the weather's perfect. The weather's just great. And I said, well, yeah, but why do you live here? Well, it's because of the weather. And I say, excuse me, bullshit. The weather's just as nice in Fort Lauderdale. The weather's actually better in LA than it is here. Why here? And then we start to have a conversation about how beautiful it is. About things like this picture of kayaking on the Myakka. I get to hear that it's beautiful. Well, why is it beautiful? And then we start having a conversation about it's because of the lands that we've saved. It's because we've protected and we've opened up pocket parks and access to our waterways here. So it is our economy. To quote James Carville, who I think is a hoot, if you don't know him, he was the political advisor for Clinton, the first Mr. Clinton. And this was one of the campaign slogans he suggested. It's the economy, stupid. Our environment is our economy, more so than any other state, and I'll talk about that today. And so I thought, instead of telling you about the environment, telling you about the economy and how our environment plays into it, so that instead of us all sitting around today and saying all the things that we do, and it's wonderful, going out tomorrow and in weeks to come, proselytizing about how the environment is important to our economy, with maybe some statistics that you didn't know. So, our water, of course, right? It matters because we want drinkable, fishable, swimmable water. Drinkable, fishable, swimmable water means that we have to protect the land adjacent to the water more so than any other state, Florida, because we're flat and we have so much of our water being drawn from our aquifer. Having land filter the water is probably the most economically conservative thing that you can do. So we depend on our healthy rivers, we depend on our streams and wetlands. Water quality is important to people. It always polls the number one thing. If you ever were to poll anybody's concern for the environment, water is the number one. And we heard that today as well from our keynote speaker. But when the state of Florida assessed water quality in 2010, it found most waters were not meeting minimum state water quality standards. Of those tested, more than 80% of rivers, 50% of streams, 90% of lakes, 80% of rivers and streams, 90% of lakes, 97% of our bays and estuaries did not meet minimum state standards for water quality. So restoration of the Florida Everglades is the largest ecological restoration project in the history of man. Protecting the drinking water sources for 1/3 of our state's population. And why are we having to restore the Everglades? Because of a century of destroying the Everglades. Drinkable, fishable water. Why does it matter? It matters to our environment. I don't have to talk this much about our environment to this crowd. But here's a couple of other things maybe you didn't know. Of course, these are just a few of our hundreds of species that we find that find safe harbor in Florida, and much of them are disappearing. I don't know if anybody can recognize, I think we have some Audubon people here, but this little bird right up here. Anybody know it? Yeah, snowy plover. Only 200 nesting pairs in Florida. In Sarasota County, there's 1 acre of land that Conservation Foundation owns, and for the last 3 years, it's been the only successful fledgling spot for snowy plovers in our county. It's 1 acre. It's just 1 acre. So you think about what you can do with land conservation for the snowy plover, and then you start thinking about what you can do for this little guy. Anybody know? Gopher tortoise. You can imagine how small he is because those are pine needles that he's trying to traverse, which really shouldn't be there because if it was fire, if fire was allowed to go over these pieces of property, then he wouldn't have all of that debris to try and maneuver around and try and find food that he can eat. But again, it's hard for us to manage with fire because of all of the development around. So blending in conservation in areas of high habitat value for some of these very important species. The gopher tortoise is a keystone species. You pull them out, everything else collapses because so many different animals use their burrows for their own lives. Matters to you. I know it matters to you because you wouldn't be here today if it didn't. But whether you enjoy sitting on the beach or whether you enjoy kayaking or camping or bird watching, there's nothing better for our well-being than being outside, whether it's active or passive. It's good for your soul, it's good for your emotional stability, and it's good for, of course, your physical activity. The evidence is more convincing than ever. People of all ages are generally not active as they used to be, myself included. And you can improve your health by just spending 30 minutes a day outside. Whether or not you are running, walking, or sitting there, you actually can improve your health. We've also found that kids being outside is not happening anymore. So we've started a program where we're just getting kids outside. There's no education. It's not about educating them about the snowy plover it's about just letting them be outside because they don't have that opportunity anymore for a plethora of different reasons. One activity we did with some big brothers and big sisters and their littles was just really a flag football and water gun exercise. if you will, out at our headquarters. So think as well about how ways you can get kids outside and not necessarily trying to cram information into their brains about the environment and just having them experience being outside. We know they had a great time because we did little surveys afterwards where they could write down anything that they wanted about that day and what they liked the best. And overwhelmingly, they said being outside. We had a teenage girl who never been in Sarasota Bay waters, ever. Teenage girl, guess where she lives? Less than a mile from Sarasota Bay. She'd never felt the sand between her toes or the water lapping on her legs. And of course, our community, which you all know. So when we're talking about economic vitality, and here's really where I wanted to get to the meat of today, so that you guys can go out and talk about how our environment and land conservation actually is our economy. In the state of Florida, $38.3 billion is spent on outdoor activities. It is a big business in Florida. $10.7 billion in wages. And 83% of Floridians say being close to nature is important to them. When Florida visitors came, they were asked, what's important to you and what did you do when you were here? So this isn't going to add up to 100%. It's all the activities they did. And look at where wildlife viewing is. It's 2 points below the beaches. And they distinctly categorize them separately. Beaches front, which I would say, well, wait a minute, they're both the same, right? Did you know that more people come to Florida to view wildlife than any other state in the Union? That's Hawaii, that's Alaska, that's Colorado. More people come to Florida to view wildlife than any other state. 83% of visitors say they want to be close to nature when they come to Florida. I got to get the slide updated. But the green column, of course, is nature. And if you look at this and you say, well, wow, that's really right up there in culture. This is all about Sarasota County visitors now, not state, Sarasota County. And we know that this is an arts community. What does that say about nature? But more importantly, look at those years, 2009, 10, and 11, and 12. What was happening then? It was our recession, right? So people were still coming here, but they weren't spending as much on arts as they were in the up years. So what does it do? Nature is our economy. And not only that, but it sustains us. Talk about sustainable. It sustains us when we have a downturn in the economy. So hopefully heard a little bit more about how environment and specifically land conservation and getting out onto green space and open space actually thrives our economy here in Sarasota, let alone in Florida. And just one more other thing I want to leave with you. You'll hear a lot of people say, Sarasota County, 30% of Sarasota County is conserved. Well, that's statewide too. And people say, well, how much is enough? And so flip that on its head and say, well, how much development is enough? But I also want to give you another statistic. Collier, which is where Naples, the city of Naples is in Collier County, 70% of Collier County is conserved. It's not affecting their ability to bring people, encourage people, have development, have people living there. 70% of that county is conserved. So Sarasota, 30%, the majority of which is the Myakka State Park and the surrounding lands. How much is enough? We haven't gotten there yet, right? We haven't gotten there yet. Thanks, and we're doing questions afterwards, right? Okay. Thanks so much.
Well, thank you very much, and let me start off by saying I'm so happy that Cooper pronounced my last name correctly. Not too often people do, but thank you, Cooper, and thank you. And also, my name is Jay Lavaroni, and I'm the staff scientist with the Sarasota Bay Estuary Program, and I'm happy to talk to you today briefly and somewhat of an overview of habitat restoration within our watershed. And I'm very glad that I've had the opportunity. This is the second time I've had the opportunity to speak with Ms. Johnson. In fact, following her presentation, this is the second time I've done that, and it really is a nice segue into the things that I need to talk about. She covers a lot of the intrinsic issues that don't need to be restated about, you know, the economic drivers of healthy and happy and vibrant habitats, the tourism value, and all of the intrinsic values are there that I think all of us understand. So what I'm going to do is give an overview of some of the habitat restoration work that has occurred in our watershed. And before I start, because I did not put up all of their respective logos, but this is truly a partnership. The work that I will be talking about is a collaboration of efforts from many of our personal partners and others associated with this community, including Sarasota and Manatee County, the cities of Sarasota and Bradenton and the town of Longboat Key, state level, the Department of Environmental Protection and the Southwest Florida Water Management District, and a few others. And so from my background, when I came to the estuary program about 8 or 9 years ago, this was one area of work that I had not had some real previous experience in, other than a few things about shellfish that I briefly touch on. My predecessor, Gary Rollerson, was already very well on the way to making habitat restoration a priority of our program. And so I want to acknowledge that, what the accomplishments that have occurred under the direction of Mark Alderson and Gary prior to me coming here, and the collaborative efforts that everybody has done to make these projects possible. Just to give you a quick overview of what we're talking about, the Sarasota Bay Estuary Program's watershed and coastal waters are shown in this particular diagram. We all know how valuable the watershed is in making sure that it naturally filters a lot of the water that ultimately ends up in the bay. So to give you a perspective of where the estuary program is coming with towards habitat restoration, our mission statement is to restore the area's most natural asset, Sarasota Bay, by working with our partners, which I mentioned, to improve water quality, that's one of our goals, increase habitat, and enhance natural resources for the public's use and enjoyment. So some of our goals are highlighted here, and the ones that I've highlighted in red are what I'll be talking about today. And it takes approximately about half of my time and effort in my position at the estuary program to focus on habitats and habitat restoration and the resources associated with those habitats. So today, I just want to give you a broad brush of the types of things we do, and I will, because of the time constraints, I will discuss two particular projects, and I will also talk about at the end of the presentation where you can learn more about some of the projects that we have accomplished and some of the projects that are slated in our habitat restoration plan. So, and perhaps if there's time for questions on any of them, I can talk about them. But in general, our habitat types are primarily saltwater wetlands, which include primarily mangroves, coastal uplands, oyster reefs, and artificial reefs, although certainly artificial reefs are not natural, but they do provide habitat for some of our depleted fish species. And then freshwater wetlands and uplands, and then a new initiative that we, along with many of our partners and actually nationally, there's a movement to look at naturalizing some of our hardened shorelines through development practices, and also tidal creeks. A little bit just about the only data slide that I really have here is from a coastal habitat management and monitoring initiative statewide. This was assembled for our local area, and it just gives you an idea of just how much mangrove habitat or mangrove acreage we have in our watershed. And surprisingly, but it's not surprising that mangroves are the dominant coastal wetland species here. We all know about mangroves and their value, and we're dealing with mangroves in many of our developmental issues. Mangroves are the vital coastal wetland plant species. We've really had a pretty consistent level of mangrove, so we're not losing a lot of mangrove acreage. I think the days of destroying mangrove acreages are history now. But if you'll notice, a lot of our mangrove acreages are very small, scattered, sparse, and fragmented. And if you look here, I don't know if the pointer works or not, I can do it up here. really, in our watershed, they're really the only remaining major forests of mangroves are found in certain parts of northern Sarasota Bay, one here on south end of Longboat Key, and a few down in the southern portion of our watershed, including Philippi Creek. And so, you know, mangroves aren't as abundant as they were historically, but in the last 20 or 30 years, you know, at least the species has stabilized. We work with a 5-year habitat restoration plan. We have a wetland coordinator who works with me primarily in the program to help us identify projects with our partners, vet those projects through our technical advisory committee. We have a goal of restoring a certain amount of acreage each year. In terms of wetlands, both fresh and saltwater wetlands. So I'm going to just talk about a couple of examples of some of the projects that we led or were certainly a part of in our watershed. That this will include for coastal habitats. I'm only going to have an opportunity to talk about the Robinson Preserve. The Fish Preserve is the most recently completed project that we did with the Fish Foundation up in next to the village of Cortez. They have 100 acres of pretty disturbed coastal wetlands that we were halfway through restoring that with their cooperation. We've been very busy with some oyster habitat restoration work within Sarasota Bay and some artificial reef work. Let me back up one and talk about freshwater wetlands, an area that we are now trying to focus on a little bit more than we have historically with saltwater wetlands. And I'll give you just some photos and some ideas of what we've done with Oscar Scheer Park. And then finally, shorelines is another example. I won't have an opportunity to talk about these, but there are some continued efforts, and actually a new initiative by our program to look at shorelines and some very needy bird rookery islands within our estuary are slated for restoration in our 5-year plan. Manatee County has done a really super job in dedicating the very valuable and rare coastal habitats for restoration and conservation. And this is a really nice slide, thanks to Damon Moore from Manatee County, showing a whole string of interconnected large parcels of coastal habitats that actually provide habitat for wildlife and other natural resources, but also for public enjoyment as well, including, as you can see here, Emerson Point on the north side of the Manatee River, the Robinson Preserve. There's 2 phases here. I'm going to talk a little bit about this. Perico Preserve, which is really the latest restoration efforts that they've undertaken. And then finally, Neal Preserve. So those of you who live up there or traveling up there, it's really a wonderful corridor of natural lands right in the heart of a very highly developed coastal environment. So kudos to Manatee County for really taking the extraordinary efforts to be the champion of these projects. So I would imagine I could give you a quick show of hands. How many of you have had the opportunity to visit Robinson Preserve and enjoy it? All right, about half of you. The other who didn't raise your hands, I would certainly encourage you to do that, especially this time of year when it is a little more pleasant in terms of temperatures to visit it. A little bit of just brief history on the acquisition of it. In 2002, it was slated for development, a huge development with the golf course. In 2003, Manatee County worked with the developer to donate or to transfer 480 acres for conservation. And through the charitable donation of the owner, the Florida Communities Trust, and Manatee County, they were able to purchase it. In 2012, there was that parcel that was still not acquired yet. That was finally accomplished, thanks to, as you can see here, from the Community Foundation of the Gulf Coast, Conservation Foundation of the Gulf Coast. Thank you, Christine. And some other donations. They were able to purchase the remaining 200 acres for this extraordinary piece of property. Just to give you an idea of the types of initial restoration activities that they did, you can see in this pre-construction slide there are some isolated wetland areas here. And this is Perico Bayou here and looking out into Tampa Bay here. You can see they did an extraordinary job of creating interconnected waterways here. This goes all the way down here and actually connects into Palmasola Bay to the south. And this was just the general layout of the overall restoration activities. And then they did a lot of plantings, a lot of amenities for the public's enjoyment. Because what good is doing all this work if people can't enjoy it? And I don't have the numbers with me, but there are many, many visitors and residents who enjoy this park. There's lots of trails, there's kayak trails and wildlife viewing areas. So certainly it is enjoyed by many. Just a picture of those people that kayak here. I think it rivals South Lido for the amount of visitors getting to experience wildlife in the seat of a kayak. And of course, wildlife is the main driver behind it, and this is why they come to enjoy it. So, a very successful project. They continue to do restoration out there. Oscar Scheer Park is one example of a freshwater wetland that we've recently worked with the state park and other partners to restore several components of this work. It was our #1 ranked priority in our last 5-year plan, and it's our first opportunity to work with freshwater wetlands, especially in this case in an urban setting. So this is a project board. We had 3 different things that we did. One was an isolated wetland, the ones that had been dried up from hydrologic disconnection. Lake Osprey, which is where the nature center is and the visitor center is. We did a shoreline restoration there. And finally, there was a large borrow pit that had been overcome with the cattails, and the slope on the shoreline didn't permit wildlife and birds. So we worked with our partners to do that as well. This is just an example of the work underway at the Depressional Wetland, the first one that I pointed to. The shoreline project on Lake Osprey with a lot of volunteers. On Earth Day, we had over 200 volunteers to help us replant the shoreline. And finally, just some pictures of the Big Lake area. So my time is up, so I just want to let you know if you have the opportunity, you can go to our website, and we do have a map of all the projects that have taken place in the history of the program. If you click on one of the icons there, it'll just give you some basic information about the project. Here's just one more slide of that further down in the estuary. And finally, I'd also encourage you to go out to North Lido Beach and South Lido Beach. Those are some really fine examples. I'll wrap up with this is now that the opportunity for us to continue to do restoration work, the funding priorities, available monies for this type of work is shifting from the public to private opportunities. And we're working very hard at the federal, state, and local level to let people know what types of projects we're doing, how we can do it so that we can continue to get the funding necessary to complete a lot of these projects that are still left on the plate. So my time is up, and I will look forward to any questions you all may have later. Thank you.
Good morning. Pleased to make an announcement that wasn't part of my presentation. We just learned that our application to the United Nations World Tourism Organization to become the first global sustainable tourism observatory area in North America has been approved, and we'll be shortly getting a recognition. And that's very timely because what I want to share in my short time is a little bit about what this observatory will be doing and why it's important for sustainable communities. And incidentally, Jay, your presentation on Robinson Preserve was timely also because Robinson Preserve is a key part of our new study area that is in this application. So, welcome to the age of the Anthropocene. Did you know you're living in the age of the Anthropocene? Well, maybe, maybe not. Scientists are still debating whether this is true or not. I tend to think it is, and I want to share some evidence very briefly of why I think that is. The age of the Anthropocene, first of all, means that we are living in a new age that human beings have never lived in before, where humans now control the outcome in the future of what will happen on this planet in such a way that without the human participation, nature will not be able to correct the damage that human beings are doing. So this is new. In the past, nature has always been able to overcome whatever crazy things humans have done before. And now science is telling us we're beyond that point, and if we do not act responsibly, nature will not be able to mitigate all of these horrible things that are happening on the planet. So to give you some evidence, the first is population. We're now up to 7.2 billion people on the planet, 2.5 billion of them living in just 2 different countries. And the patterns of our roads and urban concentrations and agriculture now consume 75% of the entire Earth, minus the ice sheets. This is how much impact we're having as a human family. And 40% of our Earth's land is now converted to farms, which is threatening biodiversity all over the planet. And productive agriculture is diminished greatly. You can see these dark green areas here are where the best agriculture is left. And you can see there's not too many places in the world where the best agricultural now remains. When the first European settlers came to the United States, there was an estimated 20 inches of topsoil. We're lucky to find a ½ inch to 2 inches in the best agricultural land today. 50% of the forests around the planet are now gone, which is considered the most critical issue for land use change. And one of the most disturbing statistics is we are now finding extinction of species at a rate of 100 to 1,000 times faster than nature intended. Now you can argue, well, you know, what is it, closer to 100 or closer to 1,000? And I would argue either one is not good. Either argument is not good. Say we're doing great and we're only killing species off at 100 times rate faster. That would be the good news. But it could be as high as 1,000, a rate that we have not seen since the extinction of the dinosaurs. And in terms of protected areas, there are very few protected areas of the world, and many of them that are legally protected do not have the enforcement to enforce that protection. I saw this firsthand when I was at the Earth Summit in '92 and visited the Atlantic rainforest, which 98% of that rainforest is now gone. But that 2% that remains has more biodiversity than the Amazon. And as we were driving into the Atlantic rainforest to look at a preservation project for the golden tamarin lion monkeys, we saw them burning the forest. And we said, how could this be? And this is supposed to be preserved. They said, well, it is on paper. But nobody stops the farmers or the logging companies from coming in and doing what they want. So there's many areas like that. So these are the challenges that we face. And what we've developed is what we call the Blue Community Program for Sustainable Planet and Healthy Ocean. Our particular program in our study area, because it is in parts of Pinellas, Manatee, and Sarasota counties, is focusing on coastal habitat, marine environments, and particularly the impact that tourism has on these areas. And the areas that we're looking at are improved building design, mass transit, water conservation, waste management, energy use, local and organic and hydroponic food, sustainable seafood, coastal habitat and cultural heritage protection, reducing the use of plastics, clean marina initiatives, education, and planning, policy, and management. And I don't have time in my presentation to go through all this, but I'll give a little samples. Our oceans are facing mass extinction. In the 70s, I worked for John Denver as his environmental political advisor. And back in those days, the major issues were oceans, particularly whales and dolphins, world hunger, Native American rights, promoting renewable energy versus fossil fuels and nuclear, and the space program. Those were the issues that we were working on back then, and all those are still important issues today. But the other issues that I mentioned have shown to be far more important. And the models that we have in tourism have not been up to the challenge of these issues. The typical model that we see, not just in tourism, but sustainable communities also, is that we try to take the social, the environment, and the economic, and somehow balance them in a way where the environmental needs are not going to be preserved so much that the economy is no longer viable, or that it's no longer equitable for the social, or no longer bearable with the social environment. And if you bring all those together, we say that'll be sustainability, but it really is not. And the new science of planetary boundaries is showing us that we've got to rethink that old model. Science is now quantifying 9 different areas where they say if we exceed the limits, we're going to have major catastrophic impacts on the planet. And unfortunately, there are parts of the planet. I used to live in a community, Aspen, Colorado, where we thought we did very good in balancing the social, environmental, and cultural needs. And we did for our community. But what we were doing was having such major impacts on the rest of the planet that it really wasn't a good solution. I'm happy to say that Aspen has become one of the few cities in North America that has actually become carbon neutral as a result, because they see themselves as the canary in the coal mine, you know, that they lose their water supplies and they're going to lose their economy as well. I'm getting my 2-minute warning here. So let me just conclude by saying our new model that we want to share is building on what is in the Global Sustainable Tourism Council, which is a global initiative founded by UNEP, the UN World Tourism Organization, the UN Foundation, and the Rainforest Alliance, to bring environmental stewardship, sustainable management practices, social economic benefits, and cultural heritage as the founding principles, where we work to create sustainable social structures and use these blue community strategies for a safe and just space for humanity and a just and sustainable economic development model that was within the confines and constructs of these 9 planetary boundaries. Thank you.
All right, people are collecting questions. Let's see some over here. And one thing I should have noted earlier, if it's for a specific person on the panel, if you could note who that person is, that would be helpful as well. You guys should. All right. So, first question. Why are, I'm assuming this is for Christine, why are land conservationists losing a battle with planning commissions and developers is the first question. And the second is, what can we do as individuals to shift the emphasis or the priority to conservation?
Well, I don't know if we're losing. We're still in the fight, let me put it that way. And, you know, we just saved 1,100 acres of wonderful ranch land and native habitat out on Myakka River just last month. It has 3 miles of the Myakka River running through it. And we did that with a plethora of funders, including a wonderful conservationist, Elizabeth Moore, who is going to own the property and steward it and wants to restore some of the ditched and dike parts of the property for cattle and restore it back to a depression marsh. So, that all came about because of government funding, came about because of conservationist-minded philanthropist, Elizabeth Moore, and it came about because of also some foundations and individuals. So, we worked with SwiftMud to get that done. They purchased the conservation easement at a reduced price, and we had philanthropists that were willing to make up the difference. So I think it's about creativity. If I could wrap this up real quick, I think it's about creativity. I think we're in a new age where, we had over 30 years of 30% of your document stamps going towards land conservation. We have political leaders who don't really understand the science behind it, so we have some work to do as a community. And we have to think as well a little bit more creatively than the federal or state or local government doing it. We have to come up as well and think about whether or not that's really where we want our private dollars to go to, and whether or not we want our philanthropic dollars, and we have to get a little bit more active. So creativity, I think, is the way to move forward with land conservation.
Thanks. This question is for David. Is it possible to offer some type of tourism incentive where people who travel to Florida are incentivized to use means of travel that have a lower carbon footprint than air travel, for example, travel by train, which could result in free tickets or parks or other popular venues? Is that a possible option?
Well, it's certainly possible. I mean, it depends on the businesses and the state incentives. There is a state incentive, though I'm not sure how well it's enforced, that any state agency cannot have a conference or convention or stay overnight if they don't stay in a certified green lodging facility. But I think more important to the question is what can we do to educate the businesses of the value of being sustainable. And I'll give just one illustration. The Walt Disney Company has set a goal to be a net carbon zero company, to have zero waste to landfill, and to never do any more development unless they can first demonstrate it won't have a negative impact on ecosystems. And so they, in implementing our 12 Blue Community Strategies, are saving around $58 million a year in operating costs. So there's a lot of economic benefits. You can do well by doing good. And I think that's what we want to steer people in the tourism industry.
This one's for Jay. It says, the question is, how can you say that days of destroying mangroves are over when we're constantly reading about battles between developers who are seeking to destroy mangroves?
Well, I'm not saying the battle's over. What I'm saying is in the last 20 years, I think probably most of the damage has been done prior to the last 20 some odd years. I mean, that chart shows that, at least in terms of acreages of mangroves, it's relatively stable. But I think the health and quality of those mangroves is probably the question. I would think that there is one fight to remove mangroves that we're all pretty familiar with, but even for the residential homeowner, what's happening is that they are managing those mangroves to a point that they're losing their ecological value and in terms of supporting wildlife and fisheries. And so I think the issue right now is how do we maintain the remaining mangroves that we have that aren't part of these forests? First of all, preserving what we have, but also encouraging homeowners and others to realize that the mangrove is a tree. It's a large foliaceous tree, and it's not a shrub. It's not a hedge. And so we have a lot of work to do to educate people that there are other alternatives to work with the existing mangroves that we have. And I think that would benefit everyone.
Thank you. This one is for Christine. With encroaching development, some efforts are being made to maintain open spaces, but how can we impress on our legislators that open space needs to be public space rather than open space within gated communities?
Yeah. It's a great question, and that's one of the things that we work on every day at Conservation Foundation. Open space is great, whether it is for public or private, but by no means are they equal. Because, as we heard in the presentations today, humans are the largest species, if you will, of impact on this earth. And if we can get people onto these properties, all the better, and the more so for our elected officials' understanding. So you talk about Robinson Preserve. The reason I did the shout out during Jay's presentation is because Conservation Foundation is the one who saved those 150 acres adjacent to Robinson Preserve and expanded that. And one of the ways that we were able to do that in the public realm and understanding why that's important, because we heard some feedback from some elected officials that were taking property off the tax roll. But when we showed them the data, actually, they turned their opinion around. Because the data says that 450,000 people go to Robinson Preserve a year. What's the population of Manatee County? 400,000. It is not every citizen in Manatee County has ever been to Robinson Preserve. It is an economic driver for that community. You are seeing businesses pop up around it for servicing people going to Robinson Preserve. So when we show them that data, and that's really why I wanted to preach to this choir about the data, because that's really what's going to make those elected officials understand. There's also data that supports that if you are within walking distance to a public park or a trail like the Legacy Trail, you see your property value increase 15 to 30%, which means that property tax value goes up as well, and the revenue happens. And all you did was protect open space for people to be able to walk to those communities. But it also takes education of those communities, because we all have heard the NIMBYs say, "Not in my backyard." So we also need to let them know that they're going to see their property values increase because of that park going next to them. And that's the work that we have to do as a community.
Thank you. Running out of time, so this is going to be our last question. This is for David. Specific question about the economic impact of the phosphate mining. What impact is that having on our environment here and going forward?
The economic impacts
Of phosphate mining.
I don't really know all the details of the economic impacts of phosphate mining, so I don't want to take a stab at that.
I'm sorry, it was environmental impact. I apologize. That's the question wrong. My bad.
Well, when you look at all of these impacts from planetary boundaries, let's just take one issue, climate change. We talked about the weird things in Florida. Maybe we ought to look at that a little broader, the weird things for the United States. If we were attacked by some foreign force, we wouldn't be having conferences on how do we mitigate the impacts of the attack. We would be defending against the attack. And yet, when I go to, I think, maybe a half a dozen sea level rise conferences this year, every one of them has been the same story. How do we mitigate the sea level rise that's coming, rather than how do we do something to stop the sea level from continuing to rise? And I think the economic impacts, if we ignore these planetary boundaries, are going to be catastrophic. What the Stockholm Institute has specifically discovered is that we're going to face a $2 trillion loss globally. Just in the tourism sector alone will be $640 million a year in losses economically. And Florida is second only to California in tourism. So you can imagine what this is going to mean to our economy from that perspective.
Thank you. We got a ton more questions. Unfortunately, we're going to be moving on to the next panel. But we're going to have break time, lunch time, so be sure to grab these folks if your question did not go answered and make them answer it. But thank you guys so much for your time.